You're trespassing on private land. Step away from the gate. That was the first thing I heard as I walked barefoot onto my porch, still clutching a half-empty mug of coffee. My voice carried across the morning air, rough from just waking up, but steady enough to draw attention. 4 sheriff deputies had their cars angled at the gravel drive, doors wide open, hands resting just a little too close to their holsters. The flashing lights cut across my barn and lit up the oak trees like it was midnight instead of 7 a.m. I squinted into the glare, heart hammering against my ribs, trying to make sense of it. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. The deputies weren't here by chance. They'd been called, and I had a sinking feeling I already knew who had dialed their number. Because standing right behind them, arms folded, chin tilted with that smug little curl of satisfaction, was the woman I'd been dealing with for weeks. Karen Strickland, HOA president of the development a half-mile away. She wasn't supposed to have any authority out here. My deed was ironclad. This ranch was outside their jurisdiction. But looking at her standing tall in her green blazer, HOA badge clipped neatly like a sheriff's star, you'd think she owned the whole county. The deputies didn't say anything about warrants. They didn't show me paperwork. They just barked orders. My pulse kicked harder. I wasn't some rookie homeowner fresh from suburbia. I'd been through this before in a different way. Years in construction engineering taught me how to read contracts, how to study boundaries, how to sniff out a scam long before it got teeth. That's why I'd bought this ranch in the first place. Acres of open land, chickens scratching in the dirt, my 2 shepherds running free without neighbors wagging fingers about fences or barking after sunset. And most of all, no HOA. I'd done the homework. Pulled maps from the county, cross-checked zoning codes, even hired a lawyer to double confirm that no association had oversight of my land. My property sat outside their bubble, plain as day. But now, with 4 cruisers angled across my gravel road and Karen standing smug in the background, the law felt a lot less like lines on paper and a lot more like cold steel aimed in my direction. I tightened my grip on the mug, though my hand shook. "What's this about?" I asked, forcing calm. One deputy shifted his stance and repeated, "Step away from the porch." And that's when it hit me. This wasn't about noise complaints, or fencing codes, or livestock rules dressed up in official language. This was war. Karen had escalated. She wasn't satisfied sending passive-aggressive letters or dropping fake violation slips in my mailbox. She'd pulled in law enforcement, turned them into her own weapon. The irony was brutal. Because no matter how many badges or squad cars she lined up outside my gate, she still couldn't change one fact. I wasn't in her HOA that morning had started simple. Sunlight cracking through the blinds, dogs curled at the foot of the bed, the smell of percolating coffee filling the kitchen. I'd planned to mend a section of fencing on the east side, maybe till up some ground for late-season tomatoes. It was supposed to be another quiet day in the country, but instead, I found myself standing half-dressed in front of an armed standoff, the dogs barking wild behind me, my chest tight with a mix of fear and fury. The worst part? Karen's eyes. She didn't need to say a word. The satisfaction was painted clear across her face, a smirk carved from months of bitterness. She'd been circling ever since I moved here, drones buzzing overhead at dawn, complaints about chickens and solar panels, whispers about community standards, even though I lived well outside her reach. She was obsessed with control, the kind of person who couldn't stand the idea of someone just beyond her grasp. And now she'd taken her obsession one step further. The deputies began moving. 2 cut toward my side gate, the others holding their ground at the front. My throat went dry. My first instinct was to shout, to argue, to wave my deed papers in their faces. But that wouldn't matter now. Not in this moment. Not with Karen watching like a queen on her throne, waiting to see me dragged down into a court. I thought about my land. About the barn I'd built with my own hands, the solar rig I'd hauled piece by piece, the chicken coop hammered together over long weekends. This wasn't just property. This was the life I'd chosen after years of grinding 9 to 5 in a city that never cared if I burned out. Out here I'd found peace, freedom, and Karen was trying to take it with a clipboard and a smug smile. The mug trembled in my hand. I set it down on the porch rail before it shattered. My dogs barked harder, their voices rising like a warning bell. The deputies shifted again, one of them finally calling out what they were after. A report of illegal storage. Words like hazardous materials and unsafe equipment floated across the yard. My stomach twisted. Illegal storage? I had nothing more dangerous than propane tanks for the grill. That's when I knew this wasn't about law or safety or community. This was about power, about how far one HOA president was willing to go to break a man who had dared to live outside her lines. And that morning, barefoot on my porch, heart pounding in my chest, I realized something else. Karen had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Because if she wanted a fight, she'd picked the wrong rancher to corner. The deputies didn't leave. They split up like they were sweeping a crime scene. One circled the barn, another started photographing the side yard, and the others stayed in front like I was some suspect about to bolt. My dogs were losing their minds, teeth bared, pacing the porch rail. I whistled them down, forcing my voice steady even though my chest was a furnace. Back, inside. They obeyed reluctantly, still growling low as I shut the screen door behind them. If this went sideways, the last thing I needed was for them to be painted as aggressive. Karen was practically glowing now, pacing slow behind the deputies, arms crossed, smirk carved deep into her face. "Told you," she muttered, loud enough for me to hear. "Violations everywhere. Junk stored like a scrapyard. Total safety risk. Junk." I stared at the barn where one deputy was shining his flashlight. The barn was clean, organized to a fault. Tractor on one side, stacked lumber on the other, tools hanging neatly from pegboards I'd installed myself. If that was junk, then her perfectly manicured neighborhood lawns must have been shrines. But this wasn't about reality. This was about perception, about the picture she wanted them to paint. I walked down the steps slowly, hands out, heart banging. "Deputy," I said, locking eyes with the one nearest, "I want to see a warrant. You're on my property. You don't get to search my land on the word of an HOA president who doesn't even have jurisdiction here." For the first time, hesitation cracked his posture. He glanced at Karen, then back at me. No warrant, no paperwork, just intimidation. My gut told me to push harder. So I did. I've got county maps, deed documents, zoning codes, all proving this land isn't under her HOA. You're trespassing as much as she is. Now, unless you plan to put cuffs on me and explain it to a judge, you need to step off my property. The air tightened. Karen stiffened, her smirk fading just a notch. The deputies didn't move right away. They weren't used to being called out like this. Especially not by someone who knew the difference between legal authority and empty threats. That's when I made my move. I walked back to the porch, grabbed the binder I kept on a shelf inside the door, 3 inches thick, packed with every document I'd collected before I bought this place. Deed, plat maps, zoning confirmations, even a signed letter from the county planning office stating that this land was outside the HOA's overlay. I flipped it open and held it out like a shield. "Here's the truth," I said, voice louder now. "She doesn't own this property. She doesn't regulate this land. And unless you've got a court order, you're violating my rights by even setting foot past that fence." One deputy shifted uncomfortably. Another lowered his camera. The tide was starting to turn, but Karen couldn't let it. She stepped forward, voice sharp as barbed wire. "He's lying. He's hiding dangerous equipment. He's endangering everyone around him. You have the authority to act, and you should act. If you don't, you're complicit." That word, complicit, hung heavy. She was cornering them, forcing them to choose between backing off or being accused of negligence. But what she didn't count on was what happened next. Because from the gravel road behind the cruisers, 2 trucks pulled up. Engines off, doors opened, and out stepped my nearest neighbors, folks who lived a good mile or 2 down, outside her HOA's reach too. They'd seen the flashing lights from the highway and decided to check in. One of them, Dave, a Vietnam vet with a frame like a steel beam, walked right up beside me. "What's all this?" he asked, scanning the deputies, then Karen. "What's this circus about?" Karen's smirk faltered. I felt a rush of strength, like the ground had just shifted under her heels. "Because Dave wasn't the kind of man you brushed aside." And when his wife stepped forward, Holding her phone high, camera recording every angle, the deputies stiffened. Suddenly, they weren't just bullying a lone homeowner. They were on film, facing witnesses. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to regain ground. This property violates safety codes. It's a hazard to the community. Community? Dave cut her off, his voice booming. This isn't your community. This land doesn't belong to your HOA. You've been harassing this man for months, and now you're dragging deputies into your nonsense. You know what that's called? Abuse of authority. The camera kept rolling. The deputies exchanged glances. The weight shifted again. For the first time, Karen's mask cracked. Her cheeks flushed, her jaw tightened, but the smug certainty was gone. And that's when I realized this fight wasn't just mine anymore. My neighbors had seen through her, too. They weren't going to let me stand alone. The deputies lowered their hands from their belts. One muttered something about reviewing the complaint and checking with the county. Another apologized under his breath. And just like that, their show of force started dissolving in the daylight. Karen, though, wasn't done. She backed away slow, eyes darting between me, Dave, and the camera. She didn't shout. She didn't argue. But the look in her eyes promised something else. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The deputies finally retreated, one cruiser at a time, their lights dimming as they rolled down the gravel road. My neighbors stood firm until the last taillight vanished into the distance. Only then did the tension ease, like a storm cloud breaking apart. Karen lingered, though. She didn't leave with them. She stood by her Lexus at the end of my drive, arms folded tight, lips pressed so thin they were almost white. I could see it in her eyes, rage simmering just beneath the surface. She'd lost this round, but she was already plotting her next move. I turned toward her, binder still clutched in my hand. My voice was steady, but every word carried the weight of months of frustration. You step foot on this land again, you'll be the one trespassing. And next time, it won't just be neighbors with cameras. It'll be a judge. Her chin lifted, but she didn't answer. She slid into her car, slammed the door, and peeled away, gravel spraying under her tires. The silence that followed felt strange, like the land itself was exhaling. My dogs padded back onto the porch, ears alert but calmer now. Dave clapped a heavy hand on my shoulder. She's not finished, he said. But neither are we. That stuck with me. Because Dave was right. People like Karen didn't stop because they were wrong. They stopped when they were forced to, and if she wanted to drag this into the courts, I was more than ready. The next week, I hired a lawyer, someone who specialized in HOA abuse cases. We filed an official harassment complaint with the county, backed with witness statements, video footage, and that thick binder of documents I'd held up on my porch. My lawyer also sent a cease and desist letter directly to Karen and her HOA board, laying out in black and white that any further attempts to enforce rules on my land would be met with lawsuits. But it wasn't just about lawyers and paperwork anymore. The community had seen her true colors. The neighbors who arrived that morning started talking. Word spread fast through the county. Karen wasn't just a stickler for rules. She was an HOA president who weaponized deputies against someone who wasn't even under her control. Her reputation began to crumble, not just in the HOA but in the town itself. By the end of that month, several families in her development had contacted me privately. They were tired of her reign, tired of her harassment, tired of her acting like queen of the county. What happened at my ranch had opened their eyes, and they were ready to push back. When the next HOA board meeting rolled around, she walked into a room full of neighbors holding printouts of my deed, my zoning documents, and witness letters. She didn't last 30 minutes before the board voted to remove her as president. The look on her face as she realized the gavel was slipping from her grip? That was the first time in months I saw her without that smug smirk. Out here, the ranch was quiet again. My chickens scratched in peace, the dogs roamed the fence line, and the only lights I saw at dawn were the sun breaking through oak branches. But every time I walked the property, every time I tightened a fence post or checked the solar panels, I remembered that morning, the flashing lights, the deputies, Karen's smirk. And I remembered the moment it all shifted. The moment my neighbors stood beside me. Cameras rolling, voices raised, and turned intimidation into justice. Karen thought she could bend me with fear. Instead, she broke her own power with arrogance, and in the end, the land stood where it always had, free, unbroken, outside her reach. So let this be a lesson to every HOA president who thinks authority stretches farther than it should. Some of us don't just own property, we defend it. If this story made you grit your teeth and cheer when justice hit back, hit that like button, subscribe for more HOA takedowns, and share this video with anyone who's ever dealt with power-hungry neighbors. Trust me, there are more battles coming, and you won't want to miss the next one.